Good evening. Welcome. It is wonderful to see such a large and I'm sure lively audience here for our first event of the 2023-24 academic year. And I know that we also have people joining us online, so welcome to those of you in the room and to those of you on Zoom. My name is Joel Berkowitz. I'm director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies here at UWM, and we are proud to present this evening's program inspired by John Tolan's new book, England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century. I'll say more about John and about our moderator in a moment. First, though, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, our friends down the road at Boswell Book Company. I know they're an old friend of John's also, because John is actually a native son who is returning from France to be with us this evening, and by UWM's Honors College, Department of History and Religious Studies program. Thanks also to everyone involved in organizing tonight's event, Daniel Golden and his staff at Boswell, Gigi Lam at the University of Pennsylvania Press, Rachel Baum, Deputy Director of the Stahl Center, Susan Wade, our office manager, who's here overseeing our Zoom, and Josh Yang from Classroom Services to make sure our technological needs are met with additional support from that office provided by Jay Piney. Since about a year ago, we moved from the fully online events we were running during what I hope will have been the worst days of COVID to a hybrid format, and I'm delighted to welcome those of you in the room as well as our audience on Zoom. We will have time for Q&A, and whether you're here in the Golda Meir Library or online, feel free to ask a question. Online, you can do that in the Q&A. Susan will monitor it, we'll confer, and we'll bring questions back to John. If you're not on our mailing list yet and would like to sign up, for those of you in the room, we have feedback cards, and we would love to hear from you, even if you are on our mailing list, and we'd love to hear what you think about the event. But if you're not, the mailing list is just for events, and I hate getting spam, so we won't sell it or anything. But we will let you know about future events. And if you are online, you can email Susan at sdwade, SDWADE, at uwm.edu, and she will add you to our mailing list. And now, I should add also, our friends at Boswell are here with a table, and some of you have gotten the book already. John will be happy to sign copies afterward. So do take advantage of that. And we also have refreshments here, so do join us afterwards for some coffee, tea, fruit, cookies, that sort of thing. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker and the moderator of tonight's discussion. John Tolan works on the history of religious and cultural relations between the Arab and Latin worlds in the Middle Ages, and on the history of religious interaction and conflict between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He has taught in various universities in North America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and is currently professor of history at the University of Nantes and member of the Academia Europea and the Real Academia de Bones Lettres de Barcelona. His prizes and distinctions include 2 major grants from the European Research Council and the Prix Diane Potier-Boès from the Académie Française. His books include Saracens, Islam in the Medieval European Imagination, Sons of Ishmael, St. Francis and the Sultan, and Faces of Muhammad, Western Perceptions of the Prophet of Islam from the Middle Ages to Today. Alan Singer will be moderating after John will read a bit and present a bit from his book. And then we'll bring Alan up to help moderate a discussion and ask John some questions, and then we'll hear from more of you with questions. Alan teaches multiple courses that focus on social, intellectual, and political history, including transatlantic revolutions, resistance, rebellion, and social conflict, 1650 to 1800, and the oldest hatred, the Jewish people as the perpetual other. Alan's research focuses on how cultural representations of Jews were used in political and social conflict. He's working on a book-length project with the working title, Jew Bill, British Political Economy, Immigration, and Nationalism in the 18th Century. And now it's my great pleasure to bring up John Tolan to speak.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be, as Joel mentioned, this is somewhat of a homecoming for me. I went to grade school at Hartford Elementary School, so I could see this library from the playground. So it's nice to be back in Milwaukee. I also taught briefly at UWM in the honors program, the classics department. And so special thanks to Daniel Golden and to all the staff at Boswell's and to the people who made this possible here at UWM in Jewish studies, in religious studies, in history, and in the honors program. And special thanks to Joel and to Alan Singer. In May 2015, members of the British movement, a white supremacist group, came to Lincoln Cathedral to revive a tradition, they said, of the English Middle Ages. They wanted to venerate little Saint Hugh at his tomb. Now, Hugh was a boy who was found dead near Lincoln in 1255. Local Jews were accused of having ritually murdered him. A trial presided by King Henry III found 19 Jews guilty and had them put to death. The boy's body was given a shrine in Lincoln Cathedral where it attracted pilgrims. Henry's son, Edward I, who expelled the Jews from England in 1290, had an elaborate shrine built with finishing touches, including the royal coat of arms, added in the years between 1303 and 1307. This suggests that little Saint Hugh still attracted pilgrims and was deemed worthy of royal patronage. Perhaps Hugh's story was useful to Edward in order to justify and celebrate his expulsion of the Jews, who put supposedly Christian children into danger. The story and the cult were still known to Chaucer, who mentions Hugh in the Prioress's Tale. 17th century jurist John Selden affirmed that every year at Easter, Jews would, quote, steal a young boy, circumcise him, and after solemn judgment, making one of their own nation a pilot, crucify him out of their devilish malice to Christ and Christians. Little Saint Hugh was never canonized, though the Bollandists, religious scholars in the 18th century who were working on cult of the saints in the 18th century proclaimed July 27th the feast day of Blessed Hugh. 19th century anti-Semitic writers in England and elsewhere relied on Christian medieval writers' stories of Jewish perfidy and murderous hostility in forging their own anti-Semitic tracts. In the early 20th century, a brochure directed tourists to the very well in which the boy's body had been thrown until it was revealed that the owner of the land had dug the well himself in the 1920s. In the late 19th century, folklorist Francis James Child recorded 21 different versions of Little Hugh's story, poem and song. According to the most prevalent version, Hugh was at play when his ball went over the wall into the yard of his Jewish neighbors. A Jewish girl invited him to retrieve his ball, enticed him with sweets and a cherry red as blood. She then stabbed him and disposed of his body in a well or privy. Lincolnshire philanthropists Ronnie and Joan Forbes founded in 1925 St. Hugh's School, named in honor of the supposed martyr. The school's logo showed a ball going over a brick wall. In the story of little Hugh's martyrdom, the founders insisted was useful to boys to teach them self-control. One has to be careful with whom one plays. The school finally removed the ball from its logo in 2020 after protests, but the wall and the name in honor of the boy martyr remain. The Anglican Church removed Hugh's shrine from Lincoln Cathedral in 1955, replacing it with a framed text which explained that such false tales of ritual murder of Christian children by Jews were common throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and beyond. The text concluded with a prayer, Lord, forgive what we have been, amend what we are, and direct what we shall be. So when these far-right agitators came to Lincoln in 2015, priests met them and explained that Hugh was not a saint and the Jews had not killed him. They retorted that his words and the 1955 plaque were, quote, an abomination and an insult to the memory of little Saint Hugh. Now, this is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of far-right groups in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, and the US, who revived the anti-Semitic tropes of the 19th century, which in turn were based on hostile medieval, what I explain to my students is medieval fake news, these legends meant to explain Jewish hostility, supposed hostility towards Christians. Now, Hugh's story demonstrates that bizarre medieval legends of Jews' murderous hostility towards Christians are not distant and unpleasant relics of a bygone era, but key elements of European and American traditions of anti-Semitism that are unfortunately with us today. But there's a danger for me as a historian studying these issues to plot on a timeline the first allegation of ritual murder, William of Norwich, a child who died in 1141, then massacres of Jews by Crusaders in England in 1190, then Hugh in 1255, Edward's expulsion of the Jews in 1290. The danger is reducing the history of English and European Jews into one of persecution and suffering. In the mid-20th century, historian Salo Baron argued against what he called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Without, of course, denying the persecution and the violence, he emphasized how Jews were integrated into the societies and economies of medieval Christendom, how they contributed to them and were influenced socially, culturally, and intellectually by them. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, a number of historians have continued in Baron's wake to explore the history of European Jews, not merely as a marginalized minority and object of persecution, but as a vital part of European society. Israeli historian Elishiva Baumgarten, in her study of Jewish family life in medieval France and Germany, finds in rabbinical sources testimony to close and often friendly relation between Jewish and Christian neighbors. Jews hired Christian women to take care for their children, sometimes lodging them in their homes, sometimes sending the children to Christians' homes. This provided daily occasion for Christian and Jewish mothers and children to see each other's homes and lives. In England, as elsewhere in Europe, Jews and Christians interacted daily, buying and selling, borrowing and lending, watching their children play together, sharing meals or stories, working together, coming together at weddings or other celebrations, or making love. Historians have paid less attention to such day-to-day neighborly fraternization than to conflict and violence, in part because evidence for these interactions, as for much of the daily life of the big majority of Europeans in the Middle Ages, such evidence is scarce, and in this case, largely negative. We know about these interactions because religious authorities tried to prevent them. Rabbis or bishops tried to prevent them. A 12th century French rabbi, for example, said that he had heard from a traveler that English Jews drank beer with Christians. This they're not supposed to do. However, maybe we should forgive them, because if they refuse to drink with these Christians, maybe the Christians would be hostile to them. And so we see also in the writings of Christian churchmen similar worries about the dangers of fraternization with religious others. So these lurid stories of Jewish plots to kill Christians often, in fact, begin with innocent and unsuspecting Christian children playing with Jewish children, only to be lured into their homes where they meet their horrible fate. These stories aim, among other things, to dissuade Christian parents from letting their children play with Jewish children. Now, I don't have time in this brief presentation to talk about the 7 chapters of my book or the myriad sources, chronicles, financial contracts, legal documents, church councils, et cetera, that I've used in this book. Let me instead, before the conversation with Ellen Singer, just look at one example that shows the complexity of the place of Jews in Christian society in medieval England and the difficulty of confronting these sources. Here, I won't read the text to you, but here is a mandate. Henry III is the first European king to oblige Jews to wear a badge. And as you see on the text, Jews have to wear a badge in the shape of tablets. In other words, that like the tablets that Moses received on Sinai, they have to wear that on their clothing so that Christians can tell that they are Jews. And this king becomes the first king in Europe to issue such a requirement. We might think that we suspect that Henry didn't have the idea himself, among other things, because he was an 11-year-old boy at this time. And we know that there was a regency of 3 men, including Gualabiceri, who was a papal legate, in other words, a representative of the Pope in England, who had a clear role in running England. So he was probably at the origin of this restriction which took up a canon from the Fourth Lateran Council 3 years earlier in 1215. Here again, I won't read it to you, but this canon, this council provided, which was one of the great councils, most important councils of the European Roman Church in the Middle Ages, among other things, among the 70 canons or laws that it passed, there was this law that said that Jews and Muslims living in Christian Europe should dress distinctly so that they can be distinguished, so that illicit sexual relations between Christians and non-Christians can be avoided. So 3 years later, Henry III is the first European king to impose the badge. And some historians, sometimes you can read that, well, that's it. After 1218, the Jews have to wear the badge. But of course, things are more complicated than that, not because a king declares something that is necessarily respected. All the more so because 3 years later, in these receipt rolls, or the receipt rolls were documents in which royal officials recorded monies that they received for different things, for taxes, for fines, and for other things. And there were a number of entries in the receipt roll for Easter 1221 in which Jews pay the crown in order not to wear the badge. And interesting, so the king or the people, the regency acting in the king's name, have obliged Jews theoretically to wear a badge, but then we see it as a way to obtain money from Jews. So the king is reinforcing his power over Jews, who were subject to him, but he's also using this power to obtain funds. Well, a number of the churchmen who had been urging the king to make to impose this restriction, and we'll remember that Gualabiceri was probably at the origin of this, weren't very happy about the fact that Jews could buy the right to not wear these badges. So the following year, in the Provincial Council of Oxford, which was called by the Archbishop of Canterbury and brought together many of the bishops of the English Church, they reproclaimed this requirement that Jews wear badges. And they said that they also will be compelled to do this. Now, the problem is that these churchmen don't have any power over the Jews, because the church has power over Christians who are members of the church. But Jews, since they're outside of the church, are not subject to church legislation. However, they can be compelled by ecclesiastical censure to observe this regulation. What does that mean? That means that they can prevent these bishops can prohibit Christians from doing business with Jews. And if Christians refuse to do business with Jews, and Jews are a small minority in English society, obviously Jews will have to then comply with this legislation. However, it didn't work that way because Henry III, some of these Jews came to complain to Henry III. They told him that Christians are now, at the orders of several bishops, refusing to sell us food. And Henry said, well, he issued this mandate to his sheriffs in the different jurisdictions saying, if you find anyone who refuses to sell food to Jews, as they have always done, put him in jail. And he can stay there until I've decided what to do with him. So clearly, the church is ordering one thing, and Henry III is contradicting them and saying, no, the Jews will be able to continue to buy and sell with Christians. So this shows the complexity of the Jews' role in this Christian society, caught between different rival forces, the crown, the bishops, and other churchmen. So as I've tried in the different chapters of this book to look at how the Jews' role in the society was developed and changed over the ages, over the century, over the course of the 13th century in the reigns of Henry III and his son Edward I. So this example is one among many in my book of this ambiguity and complexity of Jewish-Christian relations in medieval England. We have to go beyond simplified narratives of persecution on the one hand or happy coexistence on the other. So to conclude, we can pose the question, which I often have to address with my students: why should we care about this small minority of probably no more than a few thousand at any one time of Jews who lived in England 8 centuries ago? We live in an age, and as to come back to what I was saying earlier, in the UK, Europe, US, and elsewhere, new forms of nationalist demagoguery based on racist propaganda rear their ugly heads. These ideologies rely on simplified, sanitized versions of national histories in which minority groups, such as England's Jews, are deliberately ignored, and the brutal crimes of the state and other actors, such as violence against English Jews and their expulsion, are consigned to the dustbin of history. For these reasons, it seemed all the more urgent to me to recount the story in this book so that Jewish men and women who lived in medieval England can make their voices heard. Thank you. We should move over here.
John, thanks very much for that lucid introduction. And we're just bear with us for a moment while we move a little bit of furniture around, literally, and we will pivot to a different format and put John in conversation with Alan.
Coming out of speakers? Yes, in the back they're saying yes. Okay. Okay, well, so John did a great job really kind of explaining the gist of the book. But what I wanted to do is first just quickly say what struck me when I read the book over this summer. And then I have some questions for you. All right, so first of all, in his book, John explains how the Jews were central figures in the politics of the High Middle Ages. He shows that the Jews were not only a persecuted minority, just a tiny group of people that keep getting kicked down and all that. They're actually a major part of the political and social system. Their existence and presence was a crucial component of politics and even medieval Christianity. The Catholic Church depended on the existence of Jews. So John shows us how Jews were actually necessary in England until, well, when they weren't. I'd also like to add really quickly that John gives us, it's not a long book, but he gives us a remarkably broad picture. He shows us how Jews were used as pawns or as a cudgel in the politics of the day. He discusses the ugliest aspects of history, of this history, which included massacres, imprisonment, and ultimately expulsion. But perhaps even most significantly is what you touched upon just now. You discuss a world where Jews and Christians did coexist peacefully in a number of ways. And I think that I got the sense when I was reading this that This coexistence, and I think you were just touching upon this coexistence is what really upset the elites. This went against their agendas. So it's a fabulous picture. It's a very, very accessible book. And there are some really interesting things in there. All right, so I have a few questions here. One of them isn't, well, it is related to the book. When I teach Jewish history, I teach my oldest hatred class, I'm actually often surprised that my students don't know the historical connection that Jews had with money. Obviously, it's an anti-Semitic trope about Jews and money. We hear it today very often. And this book has a lot to do with Jews and finance. Finance is in your subtitle. I'd like to just first ask, just in case, just to make sure everybody understands, why are the Jews always tied with money, especially finance? And why are we talking about Jews as money lenders?
Yeah, there's several important contexts to understand. One is religious, and the idea that for Jews and for Christians and Muslims, it was often considered problematic or bad to lend money at interest, to charge interest to people of your religion. But in some contexts, it was okay to charge interest to people of other religions. So this is why one had Jews lending to Christians, and finally, later in the Middle Ages, Christian Italian money lenders became, dominant. And they actually took over the role of Jews as money lenders. But for a time, and so in this case of England specifically, the English kings who bring Jews to England after the Norman conquest of 1066, allow them to come settle first in London and then in other of the main commercial cities in England, specifically in order to do that. Now, that's not true everywhere in Europe. In France, you have Jews doing all sorts of professions. You have Jews owning land, farming, and so forth, until in 1182, King Philip II expels Jews from what's essentially the Ile-de-France, from the royal domains. And when he then allows them back 16 years later, far fewer Jews come in. They don't have land. They're mostly in Paris and other main towns, and they're mostly money lending. So Jews are doing money lending in part because they were permitted to do this, whereas Christians were sometimes prohibited, often, if not discouraged from doing so. And also because there was very little else that was allowed for Jews to do.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Is the microphone working?
Oh.
Okay, thank you.
I heard him fine. No. So one of the main kind of themes that runs through this book, and it really struck me, was the fortunes of the Jews, both literal and figurative, could change overnight. It was hard for me. I was trying to kind of map out which king was better for the Jews and which one was not good for the Jews. But I figured out it's really not possible to do that. It seems like they change their policies constantly. So what do you think this says about like the Jews' role in society? That they're being used in a certain way.
Yeah. The Jews, in these royal documents, the Jews are often presented as the king's Jews. The king is often saying, "My Jews," and that is more than rhetorical. The Jews in England are there because from the beginning in 1066, because the kings allowed them in, and increasingly, starting from the reign of King John, who King Henry III's father, Jews were directly attached to the crown. There were other lords were not allowed to have Jews dependent on them. So the idea is that this meant the Jews were dependent on the king, but also meant the Jews were free from control by lesser powers, by lesser lords, by dukes, counts, etc. So there was, in some ways, an enviable position, but it also meant, among other things, that they were the one group that the king, when he wanted to raise money, he didn't have to ask their permission to tax them. Everyone else he had to negotiate. With the Jews, he didn't have to negotiate. And King Henry III, as I show throughout this book, was a very unpopular king and a problematic king in many ways. He spent a lot of money, particularly on failed military campaigns against his rival, the French king Louis IX, Saint Louis. And so he needed money to pay for that. And he would increasingly look for all sorts of sources of income, but taxing the Jews was easy. So these big sudden payments that Jews had to make, and they often didn't have the cash. So what would they have to do? They would have to sell their debts to Christians. Then Christians who were supposed to make the loans could buy the loans, and then they could enforce, often brutally, these loans, and sometimes seize the land that was collateral. And so it was a very bad situation for the people who lost their land, who had borrowed from Jews and ended up losing their land, not to the Jew who lent them the money, but to someone who had often a local baron who had bought the debt from the Jews. So this meant Jews were losing money because they were being taxed at higher and higher rates. And then Jews were resented by the people who lost their land because of this.
Oh, and another thing that kind of goes along in the book is the fact that the Jews were the king's property. The king had a lot of enemies.
Yes.
The 13th century is about baronial wars.
Right.
So the barons attacked the Jews because they're, in their minds, they're attacking the king's property.
Right. The king's property, that's the king's lands, his castles, his vassals, his army, and his Jews. Well, the Jews are the easiest to attack.
Yeah.
What's more, a lot of these rebellious barons who were fed up with the king for, in many cases, justifiable reasons. He was squandering money and losing battles. So many of these people were in debt to Jewish lenders. So by killing the Jewish lenders and by burning the records of their debts, they managed, some of them sought, in some cases, in many cases successfully, to erase that debt.
So this really precarious position that the Jews are in at the whims of the king and all, I think is really demonstrated well in your book when you discuss the life and career of Isaac of Norwich. It seems like his life kind of mirrored the situation. Just, can you talk about Isaac a bit?
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure, and I've talked about him a lot because one of the best documented of these Jewish lenders. And paradoxically, we have nothing written by Isaac himself, but and nothing in Hebrew about his life, but lots of royal documents and other documents in Latin and some chronicles in Latin and French that mention him. But we know that in 1190, as I mentioned earlier, there were these massacres of Jews by, among other things, English crusaders in various English cities. In London and particularly in York was particularly bad, but also Norwich. And in many cases, including Norwich, Jews took refuge in the royal castle, where the royal sheriff, who was the royal official, would protect them. So we know that Isaac's father and uncle survived this massacre. The one in Norwich was fairly small, in part because the sheriff managed to protect Jews, take them into his castle. And so probably Isaac was a teenage boy when he had that first experience. We know his father and uncle were prominent lenders in Norwich. They were close to the king. he took up their business, and we know that he was then put into jail by King John. King John, the father of Henry III, had what was called the Bristol Tallage in 1210, a major tax to try to raise money, and often money that many of the Jews didn't have. He suspected that some of these Jews were hiding money, which in some cases may have been true. Some of the Jews fled to avoid persecution. Isaac was put into jail, and according to one chronicler, he had the jailer extract one tooth from Isaac every day until Isaac agreed to pay an astronomical sum. If this story is true, we only have one chronicler, it must have been a bitter reminder to Isaac for the rest of his life to go around with several of his molars missing as a testimony to the persecution of King John. Now, when King John, and I go into this, of course, in the book, there was a previous civil war, baronial war against King John. We all know from the stories of Robin Hood how King John was an unpopular, unjust king. There's some truth to those legends. Anyway, there was a major revolt against him. King John died of dysentery during the war, and that was then that Henry became king at the age of 9 years old. But anyway, when the war was finished, the royal forces fighting in Henry's name won. There was peace, and Henry's the regency ruling in Henry's name freed a number of these Jews, including Isaac, and gave him letters assuring that he could go back, he could take back his property, he could start collecting money again from people who owed him money. And this is the best documented example of this. And we know that he's close to several bishops. I mean, there was one bishop who was a close advisor of the king, and we have a little document in which Isaac sent him several thousand herrings because it was Lent, and he knew that the bishop and his parishioners would appreciate the gift of herrings. And then, after this gift of herrings, the bishop, who was a close advisor of the king, managed to have the payments that Isaac had to make the king were considerably lower. So we have this give and take relationship. It's certainly never easy for people like Isaac, but they were able to find ways to have influence and to better their situation. Isaac died well respected and very wealthy.
So you mentioned York. York is one of my favorite cities. The Minster is gorgeous. The Shambles. They have Clifford's Tower.
Right.
Can you explain what happened at York?
So what happened, and again, we've got various chronicles that describe what happened. This was in 1190. So Richard I, Richard Lionheart, had become king, had been crowned in 1189, and there was immediately violence against the Jews because Jews and women were prohibited from his coronation ceremony, according to chroniclers. Why is not clear. But some Jews came not to the coronation ceremony, but to the banquet afterwards to give him gifts. And there was a misunderstanding. Either the Jews weren't welcome there, or at any rate, some of the people thought they weren't welcome there. So they were attacked. And then this led to a general attack of the Jewry in London. Dozens of Jews were killed, houses were burned. And then there were these attacks elsewhere, as I mentioned, Norwich, and in particular, York. In York, the Jews took refuge in the bishop's castle in the Clifford's Tower. At one point, the bishop was negotiating with them with this crowd outside. He had obtained their safe conduct, but the Jews were afraid there was a trick. So they did not accept the offer. And finally, this group of crusaders attacked the castle. And according to some of the texts, many of these Jews took each other's lives, killed each other, committed suicide rather than be defiled by the swords of infidels.
Yeah, the story, there was a large act, it's called Kiddush Hashem. Instead of letting the monsters kill us, we'll sanctify God by doing it ourselves. The castle's there, you could go, it's just a round tower now, you could go in there and you're just surrounded by this round walls. And you immediately think about what happened there. They were basically trapped in there. I wanted to mention that this is kind of wild. I was scrolling on my phone and I've been planning a trip to England. So I have in my feed, I have all these ads for tourism bureaus, and York's came up on my phone and it said, come to the Majesty of York. And it had the picture of Clifford's Tower. They're selling York. And it's a really creepy place. It's just this big round thing. But yeah, they're selling it as just this majestic thing. There is a very short plaque in there. But I'm sure most tourists that go through that don't really understand.
Yeah, and many of the people, many of the English people are very unaware of this history. I start out my book in the introduction with another example of it was maybe 15 years ago that in the city of Norwich, there was construction of a new shopping center, and they found a well with bones in it. They called in the archaeologist. The archaeologist did all sorts of tests on it, and they concluded it's not definite, but what seems to have happened was that people were killed and thrown into a well sometime in the 13th century. And there are reasons, both through DNA and through the context, to think that these may have been Jews who were murdered. And so it doesn't correspond to any of the known massacres of Jews, but it shows that there may be other stories that haven't come through the text. And what was interesting, that there was a BBC did an hour-long program, which was very well done, presented, talking with the archaeologist, and also the archaeologist then presented this to the public in Norwich, and the shock of the people, imagining this is our city, and we had no idea that this kind of stuff was going on. But if you read the sources, this kind of stuff was going on in the 13th century.
Yeah. So another thing is the city and the University of Oxford play a major role in your book. Can you explain why Oxford was so central to this story?
Well, there's a Jewish community in Oxford from very early. It's one of the cities that the king allows, a Jewish community to settle in. And then many of these Jews, not only they're lending money, but there also is Oxford in the 13th century is becoming more and more important place for scholars, subsequently becomes a university. Jews are they're lending money to professors and to students. We all know about student loans. So these Jewish lenders were lending money to students. They're also serving as landlords. So we have a lot of students and some teachers who are living in houses owned by Jews. And I mentioned earlier this dynamic of how some of the big barons close to the king managed to get a lot of money by buying out Jewish loans. Well, one of them was a close advisor of the king, a man named Walter Merton. Walter Merton, who was royal chancellor for a while, he bought up a lot of land at Oxford through this dynamic, and we know that he was working closely with Jewish lenders. He had friendly relations with them, and he bought up land, which then became, if you go to Oxford, there's Merton College, which is named in his honor. So a lot of the university was built from this money connected with Jewish lending.
All right, so a couple other things. So you mentioned and talked about Hugh of Lincoln.
Yeah.
and I think you briefly mentioned that the king held a trial.
Right.
I'm wondering why Henry got so involved.
It's puzzling. It's hard to know because, there had been other cases. I mentioned the first one was in England, 1141, where Jews were accused of killing a young boy. In most of these cases, it's a similar thing. There's a young boy, occasionally a girl, but usually it's a young boy, can anywhere between 7 or 8 and 12, 13, was found dead in strange circumstances. And we would find today it's unclear whether it's suicide, accident, or some malicious murder. But anyways, in these cases, Jews were accused of having murdered these boys. And then the accusations become more and more complicated. They're doing it for ritual because they want to reenact the crucifixion of Christ. And then there are even there's the blood libel, which is a separate element that gets added on. Said, well, they're doing it because they need blood, and they use the blood for their rituals or for making matzah or whatever, hamantash or whatever they're doing. They're doing something with this blood, magical uses. So these accusations become more and more frequent. And one of the things interesting I mentioned in the book is the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, in the town of Fulda, which is now Germany. There was a similar accusation. And Frederick said, okay, I'm going to do a trial. And he asked, he sent letters to different kings in Europe, said, if you have converts from from Judaism to Christianity, send them to me. And he interviewed all these people and said, is this something that Jews do? And they all said, no, Jews don't drink blood. As a matter of fact, even the blood of animals, you have to be very careful of how you touch it, and you have to it's very closely regulated. So no, Jews don't drink Christians' blood. So the Emperor Frederick II then proclaimed that the Jews, not only the Jews in this case were innocent, but that anyone who made such false accusation of Jews would be punished. So it was the clear rebuttal of this. And we have also paper letters from the 13th and 14th century that also debunked these legends and imposed punishments on people who did it. But somehow, even though Henry III had participated in sending a couple of converts to Frederick II, somehow he believed the story in Lincoln. There was a confession that was obtained by torture, probably. And he put these Jews to death. He had a number of other, as I said, there were 19 put to death. A number of others he had brought to London, and they were supposed to be put to death. And we have some Franciscan Dominican friars who intervened and who explained to the king that these people were innocent, that Jews don't do this. So they were eventually freed. But as I said, the cult went on. And people in Lincoln Cathedral wanted to believe in their saint. They had a saint who was attracting pilgrimage, and pilgrimage means people coming, means money. So you don't debunk that.
Right. So I do want to get to audience questions, but I did have at least one more question, and it's related to the conclusion. I really appreciated that in the conclusion you mentioned Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic.
Right.
Gilroy argued that transatlantic slavery played a central role in the creation of European culture and was not just like an unfortunate sideshow. John is saying that this is analogous to the 12th and 13th century for Jews. So I want to ask you a little bit about memory, or actually in this case, forgetting. Why do you suppose there's been such a great forgetting?
Well, because the unpleasant parts of history that we don't like to think of. Just hearing last weekend, listening at NPR about book bannings in Florida and other places where, history that doesn't make us feel good about who we are, we shouldn't be reading, and we shouldn't allow our children to read them. Right. But a lot of things in our history makes us feel pretty bad about, our nations, whether it's the US or other nations, about our past. And what struck me was interesting of Paul Gilroy and other scholars like him have been working on, for a while, particularly in the UK, the narrative was, slavery was this awful thing. And fortunately, we English realized in the 19th century that slavery was an awful thing, and we did everything we could to abolish it. And it was wonderful. Now the narrative has changed. First of all, English continued to profit from slavery and to trade with the U.S. South and invest in cotton and so forth. And second, it wasn't just the English who said, you black people can go, you're free now. That there was agency in these slaves and former slaves who worked very hard to obtain their freedom. So it's the same thing with Jews. They're often seen as these, the victim, these poor Jews that are, that are victims of this violence. Well, they were victims of violence, of course, as were black slaves, but they also had agency. They also had, their stories are more than stories just of victimhood.
Excellent. Yeah. So one of the things that I think about a lot, because I'm hearing about it all in the news, is laws being passed. It's probably Florida, I don't know, but laws being passed about, they're literally saying, don't make our students uncomfortable. They're literally passing laws that say our history is triumphant and we shouldn't talk about things that make us uncomfortable. Unfortunately, that's history, right?
Yeah.
So, questions? Richard? Oh, yeah.
So this comes through online.
Thanks so much for coming to UWM and presenting what looks like a fabulous read. I love the cover. As an art historian, I'm always fascinated by historians using medieval manuscript illuminations on the cover, and a lot of times they don't engage with them, and I see that you did. I wonder if you'd be willing to give us a quick preview of the role of the illuminator William de Brails in your book.
Yeah, and as Alan mentioned, I talk a lot about Oxford in this book, and there's William de Brails was this illuminator who lived in Oxford. He lived probably a 5-minute or 3-minute walk from the Jewish neighborhood. So he must have met Jews regularly. But what he so this is a manuscript of ours. So they're prayers on, and I was interested in particular in a series of pages about Mary, about the Virgin Mary. And the story was, and this was a well-known story among medieval Christians, that when Mary died, the apostles were carrying her on a bier, and one, or in some cases several Jews, come up to try to push over the bier. But as soon as they touch it, their hands become paralyzed, or in some cases stick to them, or in other cases an angel lops them off. And so then the Jews are all very upset, of course. And St. Peter turns to them and says, if you will believe, you can be cured. And he wipes their eyes with a cloth that has touched the Virgin Mary. And they see, and of course they convert, except that some of the Jews refuse. And they choose to be blind. And so this is a story that summarizes fairly well the Christian conception of Jews. They're good Jews, but those good Jews are the ones who became Christians. And the others are blind, and some of them may stop being blind towards the end of time. They're supposed to convert to Christianity, but the others are still blind. So yeah, it's a beautiful, fascinating work.
I'll remind people on Zoom to feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, but we have another question here.
Thank you both so much. I have a question about sources, and you were talking about Isaac as someone who there was a lot of information about.
Right.
I was wondering if you could address whether that's something to do specifically with him, or whether that's an accident of the sources that have survived. And maybe if you could expand to talk about the materiality of your sources, how, why, where do these things survive to today?
So there's a fairly rich corpus of royal sources in particular. So, I mentioned receipt rolls. There are also letters, there are patent rolls and different rolls in which the king's bureaucracy recorded the letters that he sent out and the laws that he proclaimed and so forth. So we have, and then we have court records. There was a justiciar of the Jews, so there's a special court that Jews could use in particular to collect money from people who owed them money. So we have a lot of mentions of this, of Isaac in these court proceedings. We know that, so-and-so owed Isaac money, so he claimed, and there was a day in court proclaimed, and Isaac showed up, and maybe the lender didn't show, the one who borrowed money from him didn't show up. So so we have a lot of very detailed letters, and there's very little in Hebrew. I mean, we have a number of works in Hebrew by English Jews from this period, but nothing, no narrative chronicles, nobody saying, this is my life, story of my life, or this is the tribulations that we suffered. It's a strange thing, and there's a wonderful book by on the Jews' expulsion from France in the 14th century, in which now the historian whose name I'm now blanking on, but she looks at these. She wanted to write a story about the Jewish view of the expulsion, and then she realized there were no sources that talked about it. There was no, we have it for later expulsions, for expulsion from Spain in 1492. There are a lot of Jewish sources in Hebrew or in Spanish and other languages, but not for France. Why? Because clearly we have liturgical sources. So the idea was, rather than writing about my specific experiences, I'm going to write about Jewish expulsion in general, and that we have poems from English Jews about their trials and tribulations and how the Edom, the evil Christian kingdom, is persecuting them. But they never give names or dates, so we don't know whether they're talking about, which events they're talking about. So there's, and we have liturgical sources, which there are prayers and remembrance of martyrs from different massacres. So we're largely, in this book, I had to depend on the sources in Latin, the royal sources. There are chronicles not written by Christians in English and in French. So the sources are rich, but paradoxically, you have to write the story of Jews in England, not through their own lenses, their own words, but through the sources written by Christians.
Could you write the story of the Christians from their own perspective in the 13th century? Or is that just generally in 13th century England?
Well, I mean, of course, it depends on which Christians you're talking about. Of course, if you're talking about peasants, there's nothing. If you're talking about bishops and kings and barons, there's plenty. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I was very interested in the arrival of the Jews in England and the Norman conquest. And I mean, it doesn't sound like there's going to be much evidence, but I'm just curious, is there any evidence for how that migration was experienced by that population? Was it entirely compulsory? Was it seen as an opportunity in some sense? Like, what were they leaving behind? What were they going toward? And if there's not evidence of that at the time, is there any memory of it within cultural tradition? Just do we know anything about those people and how they experienced that transition?
No, I'm afraid the short answer is no, we don't. We do know that these were Jews primarily from Rouen, which was the capital of Normandy, and of course was William of Normandy, who was the Duke of Normandy, who conquered England, who claimed his right to the throne, and who conquered England. And so he allowed Jewish moneylenders, whom he was probably already in contact with in Rouen, to come. And there's no sense of why these specific Jews decided to come to London. and then from London spread out. But it's interesting that these English Jews still have a very much still have in many cases contact with French Jews, and particularly Norman Jews. As Robert Stacey, who's one of who's at University of Washington historian who's worked a lot on these questions, has shown you there were during these revolts in the 1260s when there was a lot of fomentation against foreigners being French nobles, French-speaking nobles, Italian churchmen, who were taking over our country, according to some of these rebels. Well, as Stacey pointed out, there were two groups in late 13th century England that spoke principally French. That was the royal family and a few of their close barons, and Jews who until some Jews of course learned English, but we have evidence that that French was the language of communication between Jews and non-Jews in much of 13th century England.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this. I have sort of a historiographical question building off Alan's observation about the Black Atlantic. And, in medieval historiography, they've talked a lot about England and the Jews as a race, and England then as the first racial state. Where do you stand on this? I mean, the examples you're giving suggest some evidence toward that, but you also seem to want to complicate that picture.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion among medievalists in recent years about whether it's appropriate to use the word race. And I guess I don't really have a strong opinion. I don't necessarily think it's a useful term. Geraldine Hing had written about that, and for her, these policies show that the racialization of Jews. There's also, this is tied up with the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism, which is a religious prejudice, I don't like you because you're a Jew and you've got the wrong religion, but if you convert to Christianity, that'll be fine. Whereas anti-Semitism is more of a racial process. The Jews are biologically different, and so for some historians, the more irrational prejudices, like the stories of ritual murder and so forth, in which Jews have this fundamental hostility towards Christians, that's anti-Semitic, and so that this anti-Semitism as a racism that see Jews as somehow fundamentally different from Christians is something that we see born in 13th century in England and elsewhere in Europe. But again, that depends on where you place the cursor. I really don't use the word race in my book because I don't find it very useful to understand what's going on in 13th century England.
Dr. Singer, you mentioned before the issue of addressing uncomfortable histories.
Mhm.
I know that recently I've been finding out that a lot of historical writers and allegedly great writers that we've studied in classes before have been anti-Semitic,
Mhm.
like Chaucer, Voltaire,
Mhm.
Marx even. How would you recommend educators and also students approach learning these subjects and materials?
You have to place the author in their historical situation. I think when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're thinking about what it's like today. Each person is individual. I'm not going to go into it now, but I can talk about why Marx is considered anti-Semitic, but that's a specific thing. I think that the way to do it is to say that anti-Semitism is a major, whether it's anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, is a major part of society. And even the people that we admire, Voltaire is the one that really always got me, because his slogan was écraser l'infâme, crush bigotry, crush the infamous thing. But he also said the Jews are a despicable people, but they ought not be burned. We can't throw out the corpus of Voltaire's work, his 1,000,000 pages, I think it's something like that, because he was anti-Semitic in 1750. So it's good to know, because it tells you more about the society, but it shouldn't be the defining thing. We should still be studying all of these folks.
So you mentioned a few stories about crusaders within England, and I know about the Crusades abroad, but I was wondering if you could speak more about why and how crusades happened within their own nation.
So these were crusaders who were going off to the Holy Land to join. So they were going either with King Richard I, or they were going to join up with his forces. So these were crusaders going off to the Holy Land. But just as during the First Crusade in Europe, many of the crusaders attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland before setting off east. And as some chroniclers said, they said, well, we're going to attack God's enemies over there. Why don't we start by killing his enemies here? And again, there were religious motives that were mixed up with financial motives and pillaging and so forth. So during the First Crusade, there was this anti-Jewish violence. And then in later crusades, in many cases, the church leaders who preached the crusade tried to be very explicit. You don't attack Jews, you go over there and kill Muslims. But clearly, we have other instances of, in the 12th and the 13th century, of crusaders as they were leaving and before they left, attacking Jewish communities. This is the one example in England in 1189 to 90, where you have these. And again, if you look at the chroniclers, it's sometimes confusing. There are crusaders participating in the attacks, but there are also local Christians, including people who are in debt to the Jews. They thought, oh, this is a great way for me to get rid of my debt. Sure.
So you mentioned earlier the interaction between the clergy and the Jews in terms of the Fourth Lateran Council and the Archbishop of Canterbury putting out that proclamation. Are there any instances in medieval English history during the 13th century of local clergy, like priests and monks, having interactions with the Jews?
Yes, I mean, one of the things I looked at in the chapter on Oxford was there's actually an abbey near Oxford, Ramsey Abbey, where there's a study of Hebrew, and these are Christian scholars studying Hebrew. And there's a scholar, Gilbert Daon in Paris, who analyzed some of these manuscripts. And you have these manuscripts of the Psalms. You have the manuscript in Hebrew with a bunch of scribblings in the margins with words in Latin, mostly in French, and then occasionally in English. And what this scholar showed, and I think his argument is convincing, that these were manuscripts that Christian readers were using to learn Hebrew. And what's more, they were getting lectured, they were getting taught by a Jewish professor who was lecturing to them in French. So he was going through the Hebrew text and talking to them in French and explaining things in French. And so sometimes, they wrote things in the margins in French. So this shows that, a really interesting kind of collaboration. And there are other examples. One of the texts that I briefly showed, I didn't mention this part of it, but when I talked about the 1222, the Council of Oxford, which tries to make Jews wear the badge, there's also a sentence saying Jews shouldn't be allowed to go into a church sanctuary and deposit money there, which seems like a strange thing. And there's a number of church councils in England that mention this. Jews shouldn't be in the churches, and they shouldn't be putting their money in the church treasury. Well, what's going on? Well, no doubt the church treasury is probably a pretty safe place in a town to store your wealth. It's probably safer than the Jew's own home. So clearly there was some sort of relationship where, you know, Jews were maybe paying a fee or giving advantageous interest rates to Christian priests and bishops, saying, you know, let me store my wealth in your church. It's going to be safe there. And church councils say, no, this is bad. You shouldn't allow these Jews wandering around in Christian churches. They shouldn't be here. So again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this kind of interaction, we only know because someone tries to prohibit it. And if people try to prohibit it, it must be going on. Particularly, the more you find people trying to prohibit it, you realize these prohibitions aren't working.
I had a question. On your cover, I noticed that you, I know your book is primarily on English histories, which makes sense. But what about Jewish peoples in places like Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and perhaps even the Isle of Man?
So yeah, in this period, there's very little evidence of Jews in what's now Great Britain or Ireland outside of England. In England, as I mentioned, they were allowed to live in a small number of cities. We do have one mention of Peter Rivalis, who was a close advisor to King Henry III, who was given lordship of Jews of Ireland. And that's the only thing we know about Jews living in Ireland. There's no other text, at least to my knowledge, that shows Jews living in Ireland in that period in the 13th century. So there may have been some isolated instance of Jews living in Ireland and Scotland or elsewhere, but not that I know of that have been, you know, that are documented.
Someone want to take the last question, or is that it? Okay. Thank you all for your really thoughtful questions, and thank you both for a fascinating discussion. John, thanks for coming all the way back across the Atlantic to teach us, and Alan, thank you so much for guiding us through this complicated and very rich material. This has been a wonderful start to our academic year. Thanks again to everyone who made this possible. The next event that the Stahl Center will be involved with is actually organized by Boswell and will be at Boswell Book Company on October 12th. And it will be with, in fact, we talked a lot about France tonight, even though we were in England. It will be with the French novelist Anne Barret, her novel, The Postcard, which has been a huge sensation in France. It's an autobiographical epic novel based on her family's history before and during the Holocaust. So we've got more information on Boswell's page and also signing up with us. So hope to see you there. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Good evening.
Well, thanks so much. Great.